Please pray with me. May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O God, for you are our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. When Charlie Pride arrived in Nashville in 1963, there weren't really any African Americans in country music. Ray Charles, the great rhythm and blues singer and songwriter, had made some inroads into country, but the genre remained deeply segregated, owing in large part to its deep Southern roots. Pride didn't set out to change the industry. In fact, he didn't even set out to be a musician. He was the fourth of 11 children born to a poor family of sharecroppers in Sledge, Mississippi. But he was a talented baseball player, and Pride saw baseball as his ticket out of poverty. He played with several minor league teams, but a guitar that he purchased as a 14-year-old boy was more than just an accessory. It was as much a constant companion to him as were the ball and the bat and the glove. After a stint in the Army, Pride returned to baseball and began playing music at clubs and bars in the evenings. And it wasn't long before artists from Nashville heard about the young man and encouraged him to give Music City a try. It was the great Chet Atkins who signed Pride to RCA Records, but Atkins and Jack Johnson, Pride's producer, realized that prejudice in the town, especially among the more established artists, could prevent Pride from having any hope of success. Their biggest fear was Farron Young, then one of the most successful and powerful figures in the industry. Young had a reputation as a convinced racist and a stalwart supporter of segregation. Both Atkins and Johnson worried that Young would do everything he could to stop Pride from being played on radio stations. It was Johnson who came up with the idea of engineering a meeting between Pride and Young. He decided the best way to deal with Young's prejudice was to confront it with Pride's talent and winning personality. Johnson sent Young several demos Pride had recorded without any pictures, just demos, and encouraged him to listen to them. He then took Pride to meet Young after a concert at a bar in downtown Nashville in early 1964. Young was polite but cold when introduced. Pride was witty and warm. He immediately complimented Young on his talent and asked for advice from the older man. Young was taken aback and asked Pride to sing a song on the spot. Pride did. Young was impressed. He told the young artist as much, and they ended up talking for hours that night, and by the end of it, they had become something like friends, a fact that truly surprised Young. When Pride's first single was released almost a year later, radio stations refused to play it. It was Young who publicly informed them that any station that refused to play Pride's music should immediately remove his from the airwaves as well. Charlie Pride went on to become one of the most successful artists in music history and broke countless barriers in the process. He never forgot that intimidating first meeting with Young, nor the friendship that developed from it. It changed both of us, he said. It's really easy for us to look at those with whom we disagree and dismiss them, especially when we find their views repugnant and offensive. That's a natural human reaction in many ways, and certainly one that has been more the norm than the exception over the last few years in American society. Jesus could have taken such an approach to Nathanael in this passage from John's Gospel. Certainly, Nathanael seems to do so. John is the only narrative that mentions Nathanael, and even then only twice, and neither leaves us with a very good impression of him. These verses pick up just after Jesus' initial encounters with John the Baptist and his disciples. And they've seen something in Jesus that has compelled them to leave behind the ministry that brought so many people to the Jordan for renewal and transformation. After leaving John the Baptist, Jesus leads several of John's former disciples into Galilee, and it's there that he meets Philip. And with a simple, "Follow me," Jesus invites him to leave everything else and join this new movement. And Philip obeys without a moment's hesitation. In fact, he's so enamored with Jesus that he immediately runs and finds Nathanael and pleads with him to come along as well. "We found the one to whom Moses and the prophets pointed. He's Jesus, the son of Joseph from Nazareth." Nathanael's reaction is deeply rooted in his own prejudice against those claiming to be the Messiah. So many of them had come along through the years, each claiming to be God's instrument of redemption and liberation, but each of them was quickly done away with by Rome, though not without considerable bloodshed. Nathanael knows the prophets say a Messiah will come from Bethlehem, so there's no way that someone from Nazareth could be the one for whom they were watching. He's just another charlatan, destined to cost more lives. That's why Nathanael responds with utter disdain. "Can anything good come from Nazareth?" Philip has clearly been changed by his encounter with Jesus, and he quickly dismisses and deflects Nathanael's prejudice and skepticism, and he responds with a simple, "Come and see." Nathanael does go and meet Jesus. And in just a few short minutes with this charismatic and gifted teacher, Nathanael's heart and mind are changed. Jesus welcomes him with open arms and compliments him on his forthrightness. Nathanael is taken aback by it and finds at first, and then asks Jesus, "How could you possibly know anything about me?" And Jesus responds by saying that he saw Nathanael sitting over under a fig tree. Now, this is not simply an assertion of observation, but a deeper statement about Nathanael's commitment to seeking truth through study. For sitting under a fig tree was a place of spiritual and intellectual pursuit in the tradition of Israel. Nathanael is deeply impressed by Jesus' recognition of his efforts. Here is someone who understands and values who he is and what's important to him, and who is willing to recognize him as a person. Nathanael pledges himself to Jesus then and there. As impressive as it is to find someone who truly values him, Jesus reminds Nathanael that this is but a simple act in the way of life that Jesus teaches. There is far more to be seen and done. This movement is destined to transform not just one or two individuals, but the whole world. Nathanael might well have missed the life-giving way of Jesus if he had allowed his prejudices to keep him bound. He's fortunate that Philip didn't dismiss him when he uttered those harsh words about nothing good coming from Nazareth. Instead, Philip presses him to come and see for himself. Philip invites Nathanael out of the bondage that he's created for himself and into the freedom of new life that is found in being willing to recognize truth wherever it might be found. The last few years have left most of us feeling just as skeptical as Nathanael and perhaps harboring some of the same prejudices, particularly toward those with whom we disagree politically and socially. The idea that any of us might talk to each other and have a meaningful conversation seems an almost absurd dream at this point. In the aftermath of the violent insurrection that stormed our capital on January 6th, we're left to wonder if there is even any way forward. How do you begin to reach out to those who have come to believe that their understanding is the only truth in life? How do you have a conversation with those who have bought into a lie that all those who disagree with them are their enemies and determined to cheat them and destroy this nation? How do you speak truth into a vacuum of ignorance and hatred and fear? Some of you might know the story of Daryl Davis. He's a Grammy Award-winning blues musician who is perhaps better known now as the black man who befriends members of the Ku Klux Klan. Davis had no desire to reach out to members of the Klan, but that changed after a concert one night. He was approached by a white man who told him he was the first black musician he'd ever heard and liked. Davis engaged the man in conversation and discovered that he had lived in such a self-imposed bubble that he was unaware of any of the rich contributions African Americans had made into the culture of America, particularly in terms of music. The man was skeptical of Davis's assertions, but by the end of the conversation, admitted to Davis that it was the first time he'd had a real conversation with a black person. And that changed Davis. It was the music that brought us together, Davis says. The fact that a Klansman and a black person could sit down at the same table and enjoy the same music, that was a seed planted. So what do you do when you plant a seed? You nourish it. I decided to go around the country and sit down with Klan leaders and Klan members to find out, how can you hate me when you don't even know me? Davis has gone on to befriend countless members of the Klan and to help more than 200 of them leave the organization. They've given their robes to him as a symbol of their commitment to leave the Klan and its hatred behind. Davis is convinced that building relationships with those with whom we disagree is the only way to overcome ignorance, hatred, fear, and violence. When two enemies are talking, they're not fighting. It's when the talking ceases that the ground becomes fertile for violence, Davis says. If you spend 5 minutes with your worst enemy, it doesn't have to be about race, it could be about anything. You will find that you both have something in common. As you build on those commonalities, you're forming a relationship. And as you build that relationship, you're forming a friendship. That's what would happen. I didn't convert anybody. They saw the light and converted themselves. Davis' own life has embodied that invitation to come and see. The idea that there's a different way to live, one that can be free from the ignorance and hatred that keeps so many in our society bound in fear and resorting to violence. What if each one of us would make a commitment today to reach out to just one person whose views we find abhorrent? It doesn't mean that we forsake what we know to be good and right and just, but rather that we desire to see them as more than our enemy, perhaps even as our neighbor. What if we sought to find commonalities and to build a relationship with them? What if we listened to their fears and sought to engage them in honest and open and respectful conversation? Might there be a possibility of transformation and healing for all of us? As Dr. King once said, we must learn to live together as siblings or perish together as fools. Amen.